There is a lie we tell ourselves about history. We teach it as dates, battles, and names carved in stone, as if the past were finished, sealed, and safely behind glass. But history is not a museum. It is a living system, breathing beneath the surface of every civilization that has ever risen and every empire that has ever fallen. And at the center of one of its most devastating lessons stands a single man, Julius Caesar. Not the myth, not the marble statue, the man, a genius who conquered the known world and then walked, eyes wide open, into his own destruction. Caesar was not born into power. He was born into a Rome already cracking under its own weight, a republic stretched too far, governed by men who mistook tradition for strength. But Caesar saw what others couldn't. He understood that power is not taken. It is built brick by brick, alliance by alliance, loyalty by loyalty. His partnership with Pompey and Crassus was not friendship. It was architecture, three men agreeing that their combined weight could hold up a collapsing system. And for a time, it worked. Then came Gaul. 8 years, hundreds of battles, a territory larger than modern France, conquered by Roman steel and Caesar's mind. But what he built in Gaul was not just an empire. It was something far more dangerous, an army that did not fight for Rome. It fought for him. That distinction would change the world. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, he did not just break a law. He broke the last boundary between a republic and a one-man rule. Pompey fled. The Senate scattered. The legions that were supposed to defend Rome either crumbled or defected. Within months, Caesar controlled the city. Within years, he controlled everything: Egypt, Africa, Spain, the East. He was appointed dictator for life. Dictator perpetuo, the eternal dictator. And in that title, in that single act of supreme overreach, lay the seed of everything that followed. Because here is what success does to a man. It narrows his vision. It silences the warnings. It makes the impossible feel unavailable. Caesar had survived battles that should have killed him. In Britain, in Gaul, in the chaos of civil war. He had been right so many times that being wrong no longer felt like a possibility. And so, when the warnings came, and they came clearly, repeatedly, from multiple directions, he did not hear them. Or perhaps more accurately, he heard them and chose not to believe them. A soothsayer warned him. His wife Calpurnia begged him not to leave the house that morning. A note was pressed into his hand as he walked toward the Senate. A note containing the names of the conspirators and the full details of the plot against his life. He tucked it under his arm. He never read it. They found it still unread in his hand after the assassination. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar, the greatest military mind of the ancient world, was killed not on a battlefield, not by a foreign enemy, but by 23 senators he knew personally. Men he had pardoned, men he had elevated, men who had eaten at his table. He died not from failure of intelligence, but from a failure of imagination. The inability to believe that the world had changed while he was busy being invincible. The conspirators believed killing Caesar would restore the Republic. They were catastrophically wrong. The Republic was already dead, hollowed out by inequality, by the destabilizing effects of endless conquest, by a senatorial class so entrenched it had forgotten how to govern in the public interest. Caesar had not caused this disease. He was its product, and in removing him, the Senate removed the only man powerful enough to manage the collapse. What followed was not restoration. It was chaos, the Roman civil wars, the destruction of the very men who had killed him, the rise of Octavian. And within 14 years of Caesar's assassination, the monarchy the Senate had killed him to prevent became the permanent structure of Roman government. The Roman Empire, which would endure for 5 centuries in the West and 15 in the East. The blunder, then, was not simply personal. It was civilizational. One man's arrogance, one man's refusal to read the note, cascaded into centuries of consequence. But to stop here, to reduce this to one man's failure on one March morning, is to miss what history is really saying. Because this pattern does not belong to Caesar alone. It belongs to every great power that has ever existed. It is the hidden law that governs the rise and fall of civilizations, written not in any single history book, but in the wreckage of every empire that ever believed it was permanent. Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century North African historian, saw it clearly. He called it asabiya, the social cohesion, the binding solidarity, the shared sense of purpose that allows a civilization to rise. Empires are built by people who have it, who are bound together by shared sacrifice, shared identity, shared will. They conquer, they build, they establish institutions. And then, slowly, the very success of the civilization begins to erode the thing that created it. Wealth softens purpose. Luxury displaces sacrifice. The identity becomes a symbol rather than a lived reality. And then, from outside or within, the collapse comes, not as a surprise, but as the entirely predictable conclusion of a process that has been running, mostly unnoticed, for generations. The Ming Dynasty commanded naval fleets more advanced than anything Europe would build for another century. And then they burned the ships. They turned inward. They walled themselves off from the world's complexity. The world did not wait for them. It was claimed by Portugal, Spain, Holland, and Britain. Civilizations whose hunger was real, whose asabiya was high, whose willingness to embrace danger gave them the world that China had briefly held in its hands. The British Empire governed a quarter of the Earth's population and did not believe it would end within their grandchildren's lifetimes. They were wrong by 2 generations. The Soviet Union, which had defeated Nazi Germany, launched the first satellite into space and built a nuclear arsenal capable of ending civilization. Dissolved not in war, but in a quiet hemorrhage of legitimacy, of economic dysfunction, of a system that had for decades refused to hear its own feedback. The pattern is always the same. The civilization that stops testing itself forgets the disciplines that made it unconquerable. The leader who stops reading the warnings walks into the Senate chamber without his bodyguard. The empire that mistakes its symbols for its substance begins the long process of consuming the capital that previous generations bled to build. And now, here, in the world in which you are watching this, the pattern is not ancient history. It is alive. The question is not whether the dominant powers of this moment will eventually decline. That question has already been answered by every civilization that has ever existed. The question is where in the cycle they currently are. Are we watching the generation that builds and sacrifices, or the generation that forgets what the whole thing cost? The notes are still being written. The warnings are still arriving, in the data, in the fractures, in the institutions that are slowly becoming symbols of themselves rather than functioning systems. The question is whether anyone is reading them. Caesar was not a failure. He was one of the most extraordinary human beings who ever lived. His genius was real. His vision was real. His achievements reshaped the world in ways we still live inside today. None of that saved him. Because the greatest vulnerability of any successful system, any empire, any institution, any individual, is the certainty of its own success. The slave in the Roman triumph chariot whispered it into the general's ear, asterisk memento mori. Remember, you will die. Remember that you are only a man. Asterisk Caesar had heard those words. But somewhere in the accumulation of victories, in the daily reality of being the most powerful man in the known world, the words had become ritual. And an empty ritual is not a warning. It is a habit, and habits do not save you on the Ides of March. History does not grant tenure. The roads do not maintain themselves. The legions do not stay loyal without reason. And the notes, tucked unread beneath the arm of a man too great to imagine his own ending. Those notes have a way of being found, eventually, in the ruins of what could have been prevented. The question history is asking, the only question it has ever really asked, is whether we will read ours.